Thank you. Once again, welcome to this webinar on enhancing the legal frameworks for AI and robotics, potential changes and recommendations. And we are very, very happy that you are able to spend your morning with us, sharing your insights and inputs. We want to make this as interactive as possible. I am Rowena Rodrigues from Trilateral Research, which is Deputy Coordinator of the SIENNA project and co-lead of the AI and robotics work stream. I will just share a short presentation with you with snapshots of some of our results, and then we will discuss three questions individually along with any additional considerations that you might think are relevant. In this presentation, we will first look at our approach, what are the necessary and or desired changes, any urgent priority actions, and the general challenges that we are faced with at the three levels, that is the international, EU, and the national levels. So the focus of this work that we did for SIENNA, based on our prior research and also looking at current academic policy and regulatory developments, is to identify what are the changes that are required in legislation and supportive mechanisms to make AI and robotics design and development and use more compliant with fundamental rights and societal values. As I said, we have taken the approach of looking at three levels. One is the international, the second is the EU, and the third is the national. And the context in which we are looking at this is to create an environment in which our SIENNA proposals for ethical and human rights respectful AI and robotics could be implemented most effectively. And in terms of what the SIENNA key proposals are, it's embodied partly in its ethical framework and its ethics by design methodology as well. Details of this are in our other reports on ethics by design and the ethical framework. And if you'd like, we can explain a bit about this later. So our approach and method has been based on our legal analysis that we carried out in task 4.2 of SIENNA, which was a legal analysis of developments and certain specific legal issues related to AI and robotics. We looked at the international level, the EU level, and we also looked at 12 countries within the EU and outside the EU. And you can find that in deliverable 4.2, which is publicly available on the SIENNA website. For this task, we also carried out a limited literature review, again, updating what we learned in that task by looking at current international EU level and national policy documentation. And then we tried to extract the necessary and or desirable changes, specific actions, responsibilities in terms of the action, some indicative priority levels, as in what is potentially urgent within the next 12 months, what might be a high priority within the next 2 years, and then again, what is a medium priority for the next 3 to 5 years, and then 5 years and beyond. And also at the same time, we thought it very relevant to look at the challenges that the implementation of these actions might entail. So first we look at the international level changes, and at the international level, we see that there are various actions that are being considered and taken, whether at the UN level, the Council of Europe level, to address the legal issues and impacts of AI and robotics. The changes that we see as critical include the following: to clarify and or articulate human rights frameworks and standards to address the challenges and impacts of AI and robotics. Another one is to restrict the international proliferation of harmful AI and robotics applications, referring, for example, to lethal autonomous weapon systems, to set clear rules on what is not permissible. Again, another is to clarify and or expand the scope of key concepts to cover new technological challenges. And then again, to support the adoption and use of ethical standards on AI and robotics. Another key change that comes up and is seen as very desirable and necessary is to address discrimination. Another thing we see as important is to link human rights with intellectual property law, also to boost international coordination and implement supportive measures, and to create new and promote existing avenues and mechanisms for actionable enforcement and effective redress. Now, these changes have been reiterated many times, but need restating in no uncertain terms. So what are the urgent priority actions that are connected to these changes at the international level? So we see these as including For example, incorporation or adoption of new interpretative language related to AI and robotics into general revised comments and recommendations at the UN level, encouraging UN member states to explicitly expand the mandate of national human rights institutions to address the impacts of AI and robotics. Then again, we also see the potential for a resolution banning lethal autonomous weapon systems or their inclusion in the convention on certain conventional weapons, as has been reiterated also at the international level, and the encouraging of wide adoption of risk mitigation measures in relation to this, and also the prohibition of AI based racial profiling. Other actions also include encouraging national governments to require that AI patent applicants, for example, affirm that their inventions do not violate core fundamental human rights. Also, providing authoritative guidance and resources to enhance the quality of implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Another urgent priority action could be requiring member states to report on the impacts of AI and robotics and inviting comments from civil society organizations during universal periodic reviews. Also, requesting special procedures to investigate and report on impacts of AI and robotics related to their mandates, inviting further individual complaints, and issuing opinions on violation of human rights. Now, these are priorities, these are priority actions that we've just focused on a snapshot of what has come up in our research as urgent actions. Further actions in relation to high priorities are included in the discussion paper, and we don't have the time to discuss all of these here, but they are there. But at the same time, these actions that are required at the international level are not without their own challenges. For example, when we looked at the different actions, we identified one concern is that ethics is not a legal framework. And another challenge is that clear guidance is needed, and the clarity of application is also important. So it's not just important to adopt interpretative text or to present this, but it needs to be clear in terms of what it wants to achieve. There is also a concern about further complicating the human rights landscape. There are issues about getting resources to implement these actions. There is also the concern about the extreme likely pushback from industry. And of course, one of the main and critical concerns is about whether there is we are able to get global consensus on some of these issues. Then again, with regard to expanding the scope of some of the concepts, there might be resistance to expanding what we see as traditional interpretations. Then there is also the challenge of state cooperation and willingness to adopt some of these measures, given that there is the push and the thrust to adopt AI and robotics technologies on a large scale. And also, implementing legislative changes takes a lot of time. Now we move on to the EU level. So what are the key changes we see as necessary at the EU level? And our focus has largely been more on the EU level. So we see a larger number of changes we have identified. And these include, for example, ensuring consistency and a harmonized approach and establishment of common governance standards. And there are actions already taking place to achieve this required change. Another is to increase the reliability and security of AI and robotics products and services, make them more respectful of European values and rules. Then again, there is another concern that is another change we need to see is that certain concepts might need to be clarified, might need to be restated, might need to be re-understood. We also need to enhance protection of vulnerable populations very, very much, and this particularly relates to the poor and children. Then again, another change we see as necessary and desirable is the effective enforcement of existing laws. Another one is access to justice and remedies for adverse human rights impacts. Another key change is we need to have more of a discussion on regulatory capture in the context of new measures that are being put in place for AI and robotics. This is an important discussion that has not taken place too much, but we'd like to see move forward. Another key change is to reduce mass and disproportionate surveillance of individuals. Also, another change we'd like to see is reduction of abuse in dominant market positions. Also, another two specific ones are to fill product safety gaps and to address discrimination gaps. So, what are the urgent priority actions at this level then? So, we first and foremost see movements in relation to creation of a specific regulatory framework for AI and robotics products and services, and we see this as important. Also, we need to have a measurement or a review of the adequacy of complaints redressal in companies that are deploying AI and robotic systems in the EU. We also need to see, and we would like more explicit commitments and actions to reduce technological surveillance of individuals. For example, potentially by a ban on biometric recognition that facilitates mass surveillance, and potentially a prohibition on AI-enabled large-scale scoring of individuals and AI-based racial profiling by default. And where used, these should have strict controls. So there are again here challenges that come with regard to the actions themselves, and also we have a large body of work that has identified these challenges because there's a lot of work going on out there. And so we see that some of these include, for example, the alignment of the measures with societal values and existing legislation, or whether the frameworks that might be proposed will be appropriately modeled, how are they designed. There are also challenges with regard to when these investigations take place, then they might be ill-advised, or how do you decide when it is well advised. Then there is the complexity and fluidity of AI products, services, and the value chain. In relation to what we want to legislate upon or what we want to regulate, how do we determine its precise scope is another challenge. Then again, one of the key things we see as problematic is the different institutional positions, even within the European Union. Then the sector connected with that are sectoral challenges. There are disputed views. There is the issue of getting agreement on certain matters that are very critical to get agreement on. Further, there is the issue of competing priorities, not just within the law, but even within the other priorities, as in within policy, within the industry. We also see that technologies are becoming more and more embedded in governance and politics, and this presents its own challenge. Engaging stakeholders is another issue, is another challenge and an issue. Further, there is the dependency of some of the measures on a legal basis. To create a new regulator, if that is desirable, we'll need a legal basis in law, we'll need resources and funding, for example. We also have issues of whether these measures might be flexible to technological progress. Then there are issues in relation to information sharing, the availability of information more generally, like are there enough case studies on these matters? Have we tested enough? Are member states sharing information? Also in terms of implementation models, do we have good implementation models? Are they transparent? Further, regulatory measures might conflict with the remit and relationship with other regulatory models in other sectors, or if a new regulator is sought to be put in place, then its relationship with other bodies has to be examined. One of the critical challenges is, of course, political will, commitment, and buy-in, which then also feeds into the conflict of interest issues, and whether regulatory or legal measures might have the potential to cause more confusion. Then another challenge could be resistance again and pressures. And finally, selecting appropriate targets for enforcement action. Now we quickly will look at some of the national level changes that are desirable. In SIENNA, we looked at the national level and we found that there is a great interest in AI and robotics, which is evident in the development of national AI strategies. But as our research then revealed, that there were no major or significant amendments in legislation bearing on constitutional or human rights in direct response to AI and robotics development evident. However, what we did see was that existing laws and regulations which address such issues could be said to take such issues into account, but somehow and sometimes they may fail to take into account the creative uses and impacts of AI and robotics. And we see that there have been some calls at the national level for regulatory bodies or regulatory advisory bodies, and some of these have been implemented. And here we see four major changes as desirable and or necessary. One is the improved protection of fundamental rights and societal values, which is quite an overarching change requirement. We want to make AI robotics products and services again more reliable, secure, and respectful of fundamental rights. We want an effective enforcement of existing laws. And to reiterate, we want a reduction in mass and disproportionate surveillance of individuals. Now, with regard to the urgent priority actions at the national level, we see various measures as helping to implement these. And these are, for example, implementing special protective measures that help protect children, racial and religious minorities, political opposition and activists, which is quite important from the perspective of that these types of groups tend to be more surveilled by AI-based and robotics technologies and are subject to their use. Another action could be the prohibition of the use of automated facial recognition technology in public places and or review of its use. Also in connection with the international level recommendation to potentially at the national level carry out legal reviews to assess whether potential weapon systems based on emerging technologies should be prohibited by any rule of international law that is applicable to the state in all or some circumstances. And finally, an explicit commitments at the national level to reduce technological surveillance of individuals. But here at the national level too, like the international and EU level challenges, we face some challenges, and these include conflicts of interest, priorities and interests, whether economic or political, the lack of funding and legal support, again, industry resistance and pre-existing rollout of the technology. Then again, there is the need for buy-in, political and will and commitment to implement these measures. Also, we see if there are lack of good implementation models, then it's not so easy to implement something or to create something from scratch. Then again, certain measures require a good legal basis and foundation, and then again, an improper design might hamper the measure itself. And now, thank you for listening to those insights that we shared briefly. We do understand it was quite a lot to take in, but we'd like to throw open the floor to discussion now.